So welcome to Frank Talk. This is a series that is brought to you by the Leadership Dialogue Institute. I'm Albert Dadon, your host. And today we have a co-host, that's Michael Danby. Michael is the former chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee of the Parliament of Australia. Welcome to you, Michael.
Thank you, Albert, and lovely to see you, Yaron, too.
And of course, we have our guest today is Yaron Deckel. Yaron is a prominent Israeli journalist, and he has a career that has spanned over the last 3 decades. Yaron has participated in many of our dialogues, the first one in 2009. So we are among friends. So before going to the heart of our subject, Yaron, I would like to ask you a question that just rattles my curiosity about political journalists. I would like to understand how do political reporters are able to do so without the bias of their own political inclinations. In other words, is there such a thing as an unbiased political reporting?
I believe I am one of the few, and I must tell you it's an excellent question to open with, and I do thank you for having me today, Albert. Things in Israel has changed in that matter in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years. In the past, 2 decades ago, you used to have a kind of unbiased political reporters, very objective, and you had commentators that did their job, and there was a distinction between the political reporters and the commentators. In the last 15 years, those lines has totally disappeared. And now you see many, many reporters that you absolutely know their opinion. Sometimes their opinion comes before covering the issues and sometimes before the facts. Now, there is a lot of criticism upon those journalists, and some of them are very, very good, well-known, experienced journalists, some of them among my friends, saying that you cannot put your views in the coverage or sometimes before the coverage, and this is not right. On the other hand, people who justify that say it's better to know what the political reporter thinks and not try to hide behind the scene. Transparency is important, and when you know someone's views and ideas and ideology, it's more transparent than someone who pretends to be objective and unbiased. So there are 2 ways to look at it, but in the Israeli political arena and media, the lines between ideas and vision and coverage are sometimes totally disappeared. So it's very difficult to be unbiased, and people do not know what you think and what you put in your ballot behind the ballot on the election day.
So you could say that there is perhaps journalists that like to editorialize all the time, but it's good when they're giving us a story about that is attached with their opinion, that we know that in advance.
Yes, that's one way to look at it. I'm from the old school. I think my ideas and views are between me and the ballot, and that's it. And then that's the way it should be. And I shouldn't let my own views interrupt my coverage. But maybe I'm too conservative for the new media way of coverage these days. There are very few who you cannot tell whom they vote for in the Israeli media nowadays.
So Israel has just gone through 3 elections in 12 months, in a 12-month span. Are you able to take us through the history of this last year, what has made it that Israel had three elections? Is there a blatant electoral flaw? Is this clever politics? Is that a new way for Israelis to get used to the politics in Israel?
Well, one thing I should say immediately, that this is not a clever politics. I think that's a crisis in the Israeli democracy. If there is no stability and no government can be sworn in after elections, and you have to go to the second round and then to the third round, there is a problem. And I think we should put the things on the table, and it's quite clear that there is a problem. Now, if we look back to the last year, and at the outcome of the third round of elections, one might ask himself, well, if there is a national unity government, and if Mr. Gantz and Mr. Ashkenazi with him decided to go together to form a government with Mr. Netanyahu, why didn't they do it after the first round? What happened? Why should Israel had to go through a very uneasy time with a lot of expenses? Because having elections, it's expensive. It's billions of shekels. Why did they go through the whole Via Dolorosa, as we call it, with this way of evil, and the outcome was so clear, and the answer is that they went to this journey. Three army chief of staff, there were three at the most of the year, Mr. Gantz, Mr. Ashkenazi, and Mr. Yaron, believing they give an answer to the main advantage of the prime minister, who believes, and his image is to be Mr. Security of the state of Israel. That's the label, that's the brand name of Mr. Netanyahu. And they thought, for the first time after 11 years or more since Mr. Barak has left the political arena, who was the army chief of staff, they can give an answer to Mr. Security. Well, they were wrong. They gave an answer, but it was not enough to form a government under the leadership of Mr. Benny Gantz. So we were in a deadlock number one, deadlock number two, deadlock number three. So someone had to break his own words to the voters, to his own constituency, to form a government. We didn't know, would it be Mr. Avigdor Lieberman, would it be Mr. Amir Peretz from the Labour Party, would it be Mr. Gantz or Mr. Lapid? But if everyone keeps the promises to the voters pre-elections, we will go with this deadlock maybe forever, because we have two blocks in the Israeli society and no one had the majority. So after a while, Mr. Gantz realized that the alternative is going to a fourth round, and in the fourth round, his situation might be worse. And within the two choices he had, to go with Mr. Netanyahu and share the power, at least for half of the term, being a prime minister, or going to a fourth round and maybe being the leader of the opposition, he decided sometimes you have to make a decision between the bad and the worst. And he decided to go with the bad and take the half of the term, sharing the power with Mr. Netanyahu. We should all know that Mr. Netanyahu's popularity is very, very strong, and it continues in the last, I would say, 10 years. Having said that, we should realize, despite the popularity and his political status and the fact that he is the most talented politician in Israel, most experienced and most talented, the best politician Israel has right now. For the first time in the last year, he couldn't get the 61 vote to form a coalition, and it hasn't happened before. He got 60 at the first round, and then he had 55, and then 58. And that's the minority, which means if we look at the issue, and there was one main issue in the last 1.5 years, the ability or the wish of Mr. Netanyahu to continue. The issue of the elections was Mr. Netanyahu. He was the subject. Everything was around him. All the campaigns of all the parties, including satellite parties of the right wing, like Shas party or the National Religious Party, all the parties, or United Torah Judaism, all the satellite parties and all the parties on Gantz's camp. It was either for Netanyahu or against him. Now, once the issue of the elections is you have an advantage because you set the agenda. It's your decision to continue. You are in the focus of the frame. You are under the spotlight of all the campaigns in Israel for 1.5 years. But you cannot form a government at the end of the day because 60 is not enough, 55 is not enough, and 58 is not enough. So Mr. Netanyahu had to go to a very important decision if he wants to continue to a 4th round or to share the power with Mr. Gantz, whom he didn't think he will get to the point because by his decision, there was a history made in the Israeli politics that Mr. Netanyahu set an expiration date for his prime ministership. It never happened before. And the date is November 17th, 2021. That's the date he will be replaced by Mr. Gantz if he doesn't impose or work for early elections before. Some people say that he will never meet his obligation because he gave so many obligations in the past and sometimes he never executed his own decisions and agreements.
Yaron,
yes.
in the meantime, just because a lot of people outside Israel won't follow this as closely as you or have your knowledge, in the meantime, Gantz is defense minister and Gabi Ashkenazi, who was also in the opposition, is foreign minister. Is that correct?
Yes. Now we have a Likud and blue and white cabinet with 34 ministers in the cabinet. It's the largest cabinet Israel ever had in its history. And Mr. Netanyahu is the prime minister for 1.5 years. Mr. Gantz is the prime minister after 1.5 years and the minister of defense. Mr. Ashkenazi is the minister of foreign affairs. And the Likud has Ministry of Finance, which is very, very important, especially nowadays. I don't have to elaborate. Mr. Israel Katz, who is a Likud senior member, is the Minister of Finance in the cabinet of Israel. But this is a cabinet with double heads, Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gantz. It's unclear yet if Mr. Netanyahu is able to share the power, because since Mr. Ehud Barak, who was the Minister of Defense till 2013, left the cabinet, which means 7 years, in the last 7 years, Mr. Netanyahu was a solo leader in his own government. And now he has to share with the power, and there is a clear agreement, 14 pages agreement between him and Mr. Gantz, that all the crucial decisions, including crucial nominations of the chief of police, for instance, he will have to share the decision with Mr. Gantz. He cannot go himself and make a decision, and that he doesn't have a majority in the government. It's a parallel power between blue and white and the Likud, despite the fact that Likud has more ministers than blue and white, but they decided to share the power 50-50. And this is for the first time under Netanyahu's leadership. Even in the 90s, he didn't share the power with anyone else, like he had decided to make it, to do it now. But this is due to the outcome of the third round of the election and the fact that he failed 3 times to set the majority of 61 members of parliament out of 120.
Yaron, if we can go back to before the third election, there was for the first time opposition within the Likud party to Bibi Netanyahu, and you had Gideon Sa'ar that actually challenged him. Can you please tell us the outcome of that, and what is the outcome for Mr. Sa'ar?
Well, Mr. Netanyahu got a rival in the Likud party for the first time in many, many years. Because there were elections in the Likud party, but the people who ran against Mr. Netanyahu had really no chance. Mr. Dadon, who is the Israeli ambassador in the United Nations, for instance, ran against Mr. Netanyahu and other people. But it was a clear cut that Mr. Netanyahu is the one who is going to be elected, and his power in the Likud party is not questionable. For the first time, one of the Likud senior members, and Mr. Gideon Sa'ar is a senior member and a very popular member of the Likud, usually got the first seat in the primaries or the second one. This time when elections took place in the Likud party, Mr. Netanyahu tried to block him, and he got a fourth seat, or the 5th seat, and this is a very, very important position. He ran against Mr. Netanyahu, saying that Mr. Netanyahu failed to form a government 2 times, and he will fail for the first time. And Mr. Sa'ar said, give me a chance, I can form a government easily and much easier than Mr. Netanyahu. Now, the common wisdom in the Israeli politics, including among rivals of Mr. Netanyahu, like Mr. Avigdor Lieberman, was that if another Likud member will lead the Likud, they could have a government, because the opposition to Mr. Netanyahu is a personal opposition, not ideological. This was a personal third round elections around Mr. Netanyahu's leadership. That was the whole issue, the one and only issue. And there was the common wisdom was once Mr. Netanyahu decides to quit or being replaced by free democratic primaries within the Likud party, his successor will have a better chance to form any government any government he wants, either a right-wing government or a national unity government. But the brand name Netanyahu is stronger than the Likud brand name these days. The Likud is Netanyahu, and I don't have to say much more about that. So it's almost impossible, and Mr. Sa'ar, he is a very talented politician and he knew his position, it's very, very difficult to dismiss a leader of the Likud. And I have to remind the history, one of the Likud and the other one of the State of Israel. In the Likud, no one of the 4 leaders was ever beaten in his own party. Not Menachem Begin, and someone was against Menachem Begin. Not Mr. Sharon, when Netanyahu was an opponent to Mr. Sharon. Not Mr. Netanyahu himself, and not Mr. Shamir, who was 7 years Prime Minister of Israel, and he had a few very strong, powerful politicians in the Likud party as opponents, but it was never done before that a leader of the Likud party lost elections in his own party. This is a trivia part we should remember when we talk about the Likud party. So Mr. Sa'ar got 27.5%.
That is quite honorable, isn't it?
Pardon?
That is quite honorable.
Yes, yes, of course, but it's far from 50%. And I'll get to the outcome of what happened to Mr. Saar. So he was brave to run against the prime minister, and it's absolutely being brave because other members of the Likud, even those who thought like Mr. Saar that Mr. Netanyahu cannot form a government anymore, they didn't have the same bravery to run against Mr. Netanyahu. And the other part of the history of Israel is that whenever a prime minister of Israel had shown weakness in the national level, his own party did not dismiss him from power, either in the Likud or in the Labour Party. I'll give you two examples. Mr. Barak was a lame duck political figure in 2001 when Mr. Sharon was running against him. And his party said, well, you are the leader and you will run. And they didn't replace him. And he lost the elections. And Sharon formed the government of the disengagement later in 2001. This is one. Mr. Shamir, 1992. It was quite clear that Mr. Rabin is going to win. But the Likud party stick to Mr. Shamir and they lost the elections. So on the history national level, a party of the prime minister does not send him home. Unlike the UK, for instance, if Mrs. Thatcher is not popular anymore, or Mr. Blair, or I don't know whom, and they can change power within the party to win the elections on national level. In Israel, somehow they prefer to lose than to depart from their own leader. The outcome of the elections of Mr. Saar and Mr. Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu was elected, and Mr. Saar is the opponent. And Mr. Netanyahu, as he usually does, decided not to include Mr. Saar in the cabinet. Though Mr. Saar was a very popular minister of education for 4 years, he was a minister of interior, he was a secretary of two cabinets, the cabinet of Mr. Netanyahu, the cabinet of Mr. Sharon. He is very experienced politician, and people think that Mr. Netanyahu is losing by not having such a talented, experienced politician in his own cabinet. He could be a great consultant to a prime minister under the challenges Israel is facing. But politics is politics, and Mr. Netanyahu decides that Mr. Saar will be out. Mr. Netanyahu doesn't like opponents around him. So we can see another potential opponents like Mr. Gilad Dadon, who was a minister of internal security. He is sent to the diaspora to be a UN ambassador, the Israeli ambassador in the UN, far and beyond. Mr. Saar is out, and Mr. Edelstein, who also has a wish to be a candidate after Mr. Netanyahu's era, was sent to Ministry of Health. Nowadays, the Ministry of Health is a very important ministry, but usually you don't become a prime minister after serving as a minister of health. So Mr. Netanyahu was giving us a sense that he is here to stay, despite the trial he is facing in court. He is here to stay. He doesn't want his opponents to be in a high portfolio cabinet positions. And we are still in the Likud party in the one leader formula of Mr. Netanyahu. And that was not the case till 10 years ago. Likud, after Begin, the late Prime Minister Begin, the Likud had always number 2 and number 3, or number 2 and another number 2, who were always ready to take the lead if the Prime Minister has to go, or if something happens to the Prime Minister. Now in the Likud, Mr. Netanyahu, after 10 years, he wants to be there by himself, not surrounded by anyone who might challenge him in the near future or in the far future.
So in terms of Mr. Saar, of course, now is kind of a backbencher. so he can continue his aspiration from the backbench and probably form a group that can oppose the prime minister from within the Likud. So while this is maybe expedient for Mr. Netanyahu not to have Sar inside, but I think that Sar is going to be more problematic for him on the outside than the inside. Would you agree with that?
I agree. I totally agree. And I think Mr. Netanyahu understands that. And that's why he tries to break his political group, Mr. Sar's political group in the parliament. So he will have now he had a group of 5 out of 36 of the Likud. So one was chosen to be a deputy minister already, deputy minister of health. So he takes someone who is a key member of Sar's camp to be a deputy minister and he owes Mr. Netanyahu because Mr. Netanyahu nominated him. Another one is going to be an ambassador in Australia, Miss Sharon Haskell, a member of parliament.
Has this been announced already?
No,
Well,
but
you
that's
just
the plan. No, it was not announced. It was not announced, but if the prime minister thinks politically, he has to take those 5 members of Sar's camp and send them away. So Sar will be left with himself or with another 1 or 2, which is a very small group in the parliament. So there is a chance that Miss Sharon Haskell will be an ambassador in
Send her to
Canberra.
New Zealand, please.
Pardon?
Send her to New Zealand.
I'm not making the decision, but if you want to give the idea to the Prime Minister's office, you are most welcome to. She was mentioned as a member an ambassador in Canberra and not in New Zealand. So
she's been to Australia, Albert, a number of times, and she knows Australia quite well. She stayed here actually for 3 weeks at one stage, and she's very articulate, English-speaking. She doesn't have experience as a diplomat, but of the many politicians that Israel has, she's a capable one. I wouldn't put it any stronger than that.
But that's true. But if you look at the nominations of the cabinet under Netanyahu in the last 2 weeks, he doesn't look always who fits to the job, but who fits the political ideas and the plan of the prime minister. So you see some ministers in different ministries, and you ask yourself, what do they do there? Because they don't look fit to the job they were nominated. But it's like I said it on one of my analysis on the public TV channel, that politics under Netanyahu in this cabinet is Legoland. And in Legoland, you take different kinds of and try to put them together. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. So we have a Legoland politics.
Yeah, what happened to Avi Dichter?
Poor Avi Dichter. Avi Dichter, who is another very experienced politician, and also used to be a head of the security service, as you know. He had an aspiration to be a member of the cabinet, but Mr. Netanyahu decided that he won't be. And he decided that he will serve as a backbencher. And Mr. Dichter is very disappointed. Since the cabinet sworn in, he didn't give an interview, as I remember. And he talked a lot before on the media. And he will serve as a backbencher and hope that on the era of post-Netanyahu, he might be promoted, but nobody knows when is post-Netanyahu era. And I would remind you that late Miss Professor Ben-Zion Netanyahu passed away at the age of 102, and Mr. Netanyahu is only 71. So if he wants to continue, and if you calculate, it's only 31 years to go, which means a lot of time for Israel politics.
I wish the calculation were that simple, Yaron. But can I also ask you, about Mr. Lieberman. In the end,
Sure.
who did he go with?
Mr. Avigdor Lieberman was a close partner of Mr. Netanyahu since the 90s. They had fights, they had agreements, they had peace agreements. It was ups and downs, many downs in their career, in their common career, and many ups. They even ran together in one party, Likud Beitenu, once. He served as his general director of the Prime Minister's office in the 90s, and then he was Minister of Foreign Affairs for 6 years. He was Minister of Defense for 2.5 years. And there was a huge black elephant who crossed their road. It wasn't a black cat, it was a black elephant. And in the last 3 rounds of elections, Mr. Lieberman made a strategic decision that he wants Mr. Netanyahu to depart from Israeli politics. It was totally personal, not an issue of ideology, totally personal. And many people ask themselves, what happened? Why now? What happened? Because they were so close partners in the past. And I believe that Mr. Lieberman is one that knows Mr. Netanyahu better than other politicians, even in the Likud party, because he really was close to him. He know all the secrets behind the scene. Now, what happened? We, political commentators, believe that when there was a police investigation against the party of Mr. Lieberman on the eve of elections, the elections of 2015, 5 years ago. Mr. Lieberman was not a suspect and he was not under investigation, but all his close circle, the closest circle, was indicted and some of them are in jail. There are some trials that still go on. We believe that Mr. Lieberman believes that Netanyahu was the trigger for the election, for the investigation, who almost killed Israel Beitenu totally. And he cannot forget that and he cannot forgive for that. He cannot forgive that, Mr. Netanyahu. Now, if this is true, we get a motive why Mr. Netanyahu is under or Mr. Lieberman sees Mr. Netanyahu as someone that has to get a revenge. And the revenge is very, very tough because in the last 3 rounds, Mr. Lieberman, first of all, he was in the center saying, I'm not going to give Netanyahu because of different, there were gaps on our ideology and the ideology of the government, potential government, and I cannot agree with it. But in the last 2 rounds, it was clear that he's with the opposition to Mr. Netanyahu. He was in the block of Mr. Gantz, totally, including willingness to get a minority government under Mr. Gantz with the support of the Arab Party. Mr. Lieberman was for it because his hatred to the prime minister. But Mr. Netanyahu is the prime minister, and Mr. Lieberman is now a member of the opposition with less power and much less influence. Someone who was 6 years Minister of Foreign Affairs and 2.5 years Minister of Defense. It's not an easy task to be just a member of parliament in the opposition, and this government might survive 3 years at least if Netanyahu respects the agreement he signed with Mr. Gantz. So Mr. Lieberman might find himself in a very frustrating position at the moment.
Before I go to you, Michael, with important questions about foreign policy, please let me ask Yaron this last question on Israeli internal affairs. And
sure.
That's the one about Mr. Netanyahu and his court case. So I believe the court case has finally started on Sunday, 2 days ago. And what is the outcome so far? You are talking, Yaron, as if Mr. Netanyahu can complete his term until November 2021. But what if he's found guilty? What if he's indicted? What happens then? And what is the exact story? Why is he being taken to court by the Attorney General?
Well, it's a long story. I'll try to make it short. The investigation started 3.5 years ago on different issues of corruption. The most serious one, he's indicted, is bribery, and this is the most severe accusation against a political figure in Israel. And the punishment is jail for bribery. It's quite clear. All the politicians who were convicted in bribery served in jail. Now, in the last year, the general attorney decided, after a hearing, to go to court with the prime minister. According to the Israeli law, the prime minister can serve until a final decision of the Supreme Court after the appeal. Now, the timetable is very, very long. We believe that the court will deal with the issues. One of them is a huge issue, at least 2.5 years. The trial has not started yet. It's just pre-trial discussions at the moment. The trial will start probably within half a year and will take 2 years. It brings us to 2022, after the rotation between Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gantz. After the decision of the court, there will be an appeal, either the general attorney or Mr. Netanyahu, it doesn't matter. It will take another year, a year. So we are now in the end of May. We are talking about 3.5 years from now, 2024. Now, till 2024, Netanyahu is here. The only obstacle, now the law does give him a possibility to serve as a prime minister and be in court, having the court session at 9 a.m. and a cabinet meeting at 7 p.m. That's under the Israeli law. Only a final verdict. If he is convicted, he has to quit. Final verdict means after the Supreme Court decision, after the appeal. Now, on the other hand, there was a decision of the Supreme Court 27 years ago that a minister, not a prime minister, but a minister cannot serve as a minister when he is in court. That was under Mr. decision called the Aryeh Deri decision. In 1993, Supreme Court made a decision that if he goes to court, he has to quit, and if he doesn't quit, the prime minister must fire him, must. And there was an order to Prime Minister Rabin to fire Mr. Deri, and he had to do that. Now, after the rotation, in November 17, 2021, Netanyahu stopped serving as the prime minister and starts serving as a senior minister. According to a decision of the Supreme Court, he might have to resign, as Deri did, and if not, Prime Minister Gantz will have to fire him. So they changed the law, the substantial law, or the fundamental law, the fundamental law of government in Israel, that the prime minister and the deputy prime minister have both the same status on serving under trial, which means not only the prime minister can serve when he is in court, also his deputy, and the deputy status is different than other ministers. All the other ministers, if they go to court, have to quit or to be fired. Deputy prime minister, like the prime minister, will serve as long as there is no final verdict after the appeal in the Supreme Court. Now, what's the obstacle? They changed the law. Now the law is clear for Mr. Netanyahu. There is an appeal to the Supreme Court that what they did is totally unright. And you cannot change a fundamental law in Israel because of convenience of politics for Mr. Gantz and for Mr. Netanyahu. Law is serving the public, not serving Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gantz. The Supreme Court has not made a decision yet about this appeal. What's the status of a deputy prime minister once he's indicted as a deputy prime minister? Is his status like a prime minister, as they said, as the law says now, or the law is unconstitutional and they have to cancel, and the Supreme Court has to cancel the law and say, Mr. Netanyahu, you cannot be a minister, even a senior, super duper senior, you cannot, we don't have that. It's either a prime minister or a minister, and that's it. Face the facts. Now, we don't know what's going to happen in the Supreme Court. I personally think that they will not interfere. And if that's the case, Netanyahu is going to serve as a deputy prime minister since November 2021. And when we look at him now, it's clear that he's here to stay and running for another elections, unless one scenario we should bear in mind, there is another elections in July 2021. I'm not correct, yeah, if I'm not wrong, for the president of Israel. And there is an option that Mr. Netanyahu will decide, after being a prime minister for 14 years, not consecutive, but 14 years, to run for a job of the president, which is one term of 7 years. And the main advantage is not only the power and the honor, there are no criminal cases against presidents. If you are a president, you cannot be indicted under law, which means if Netanyahu is elected to be president, the case is closed for 7 years. And if he's 72 when he's elected to be president, retires at the age of 79, and then the court will have to make a decision if someone at the age of 80 will continue a trial that has started 10 years earlier. That's a scenario we should all bear in mind because Israeli politics, it's not just a politics, it's a jungle. And jungle,
but Yaron, we have to remember that a previous president, Moshe Katsav, Prime Minister Howard, invited me to Parliament House with Malcolm Turnbull to have lunch with one day. He was convicted after being a president. And we've also got the caveat of, you said of Benzion Netanyahu, who I had the honor of attending his shiva and also meeting twice while he was alive. He lived to be 100. So even if Netanyahu was to serve as president until the age of 79, he might live as long as Benzion, and he could have the same consequences as Katsav.
No, because rape and murder is not bribery. It's not the same. And the bribery is in his job is as serving as the prime minister, not as a private person. So you cannot look at the rape or murder, for God's sake, or physical, breaking the law on physical issues, like money laundering, getting gifts, or so it will be different. Now, it's all precedent because we didn't have an issue before that a prime minister who is under trial decides to go and the parliament choose the president. It's not up to the people. So who knows what happened behind the ballot when the 100 and 120 make a decision who is going to be the next president after Mr. Ruvi Rivlin, who is a very successful president of Israel right now. We don't know yet. But this is a scenario it's nice to bear in mind.
Yaron, can I ask you a cross-cultural question affecting both Israel and...
May I cut in? Michael,
sure.
We only have 20 minutes left. Yaron's answers are so fascinating. May I suggest, you've got very interesting questions about foreign policies of Israel. may I suggest that you attack those. And for sure, we need to have Yaron back, and Michael, so there'll be much more opportunities to ask him if he's, with his permission, of course, but if he's okay with that, we will need to have a second and third session in the future. So can I ask you to start with your interesting questions about foreign policy, with what's happening in Iran in particular?
Okay. Recently, we had the Iranian leader call for the eradication of Israel. Even our friends in the European Union condemned that. The Canadians did, apparently Americans. I'm sure we'll get a good comment out of Australia as well. So there's violent rhetoric from Tehran. There is also a cyber attack, which is very interesting for Australia. We might face a similar thing from another unnamed country in the future on all of Israel's water facilities. Fourfold, very sophisticated attack, and an even more interesting Israeli response, which crippled the new Iranian port in Bandar Abbas, the new terminal in Bandar Abbas. So you've got this violent rhetoric, cyber warfare, but at the same time I read that slowly, quietly, the Iranians are responding to the unending Israeli military pressure in Syria and drawing back their forces. Not absolutely, not so that it will be noticed, but the military pressure seems to be working in Syria on the Iranian deployments. So how do you reconcile this violent rhetoric, cyber warfare, and what's happening on the ground in Syria?
Yes. Well, you gave, first of all, let me give you a compliment of giving a very nice overview of what's going on. So these are the facts, and you elaborated it quite clearly. But there is one thing we should remember, that Israel here is not acting alone. And we should remember another person here, which is very important to this equation of Iran-Israeli relationship, cyber attack, and the rhetoric coming from Tehran, which we heard 10 years ago when there was a president named Ahmadinejad. We remember what he said. And this is Mr. Donald Trump. Mr. Donald Trump decided to withdraw from the agreement, leaving the Europeans alone, the agreement that Obama made with Iran. And he did it because he didn't like Obama, and I think he did it also under the pressure of the Prime Minister of Israel when Mr. Trump canceled this or withdrew from the agreement. Now, there are quite tough sanctions from the US towards Tehran at the moment. The coronavirus issue shakes the whole world, including Iran, as we know, and I'm sure the numbers that were published are not the realistic numbers, and they are hiding. But we see that the pressure is now moving troops from Syria, or there is a move from, as you mentioned, from Syria out. But when you talk to military experts, and I'm a political one, but when I talk to military experts in Israel, it's quite clear that Iran is the main challenge of the state of Israel, not the Hamas, not the West, the Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, as people call it. And Hezbollah is a problem only as an annex of Iran, not by itself. And Syria also, Iran, the presence of troops of Iran and the relationship between Russia, Syria, Iran. This triangle is a headache to Israel, and the Russians are not always helpful when it comes to Iran, as we know. So I think that the fact that Mr. Netanyahu in his security cabinet has now 2 army chief of staff and another general, Mr. Gallant, who is a Likud member. Mr. Gantz as an army chief of staff, Mr. Ashkenazi as army chief of staff. I'm sure that Iran will be on the table and will be in the focus of this cabinet. We don't know how and what's going to happen. I'm sure that Netanyahu will be very careful before going to a full confrontation with Iran, as he was in the last 10 years. He talked about it, he declared about it, he put pressure on the US and the UN and the Europeans. But military confrontation, I doubt if Mr. Netanyahu really wants to go for it when Israel is acting by itself. And it seems unlikely that President Trump, after 10 years of involvement in Iraq and of US troops in Iraq and in Afghanistan, that Mr. Trump, when he talks about make America first, great again, and America first, that he is going to be willing to send troops to Iran, even the aircrafts of the US. So if Netanyahu sees that Israel is alone, I think all the other means of pressure, economical, cyber, international community, will be taken before we get to the point of military action. As Netanyahu showed us before.
That's a very good segue into my next question about Israel and China, because Yaron, any country, sensible country that has a conflict with another country wants to avoid what they, in military terms, the fashionable word is kinetic action. They don't want to be involved in wars if they can achieve things by other means. So to have the Americans on side with Iran, that's changed under Trump with the economic sanctions and all of the other activities that the Americans do with Israel against Iran is very valuable, including having their support in Syria for what the Israelis are doing, the remorseless bombing of Iranian outposts, etc. But recently, Mr. Pompeo came to Israel. And we know this very well because we're very advanced in the discussion of the Five Eyes, Western Alliance issues with China, even before this COVID business swept the world and showed the ugly face of Beijing to the world. Why would Israel make the Americans broigus when you need them so much? Broigus angry over allowing, as Albert has pointed out to me, not just the port of Haifa, but the point of Haifa and Eilat to Chinese high technology. The American 7th Fleet, I understand, Yaron, comes into Haifa. Isn't it better to have the American 7th Fleet than some cheap Chinese technology? You save $10, but you waste it.
Look, I'll tell you a little story when I answer this. I served as the Washington bureau chief of the Israeli Public TV and Radio between 2002 and 2007. And then there was the issue of the Falcon airbornes that Israel was willing to fix or upgrade. And the US didn't like that. And Israel decided that the business with the Chinese government in 2005 or 6, I don't remember the exact year, was very important to the well-being of Israel. And they did go for it. And the US Pentagon was very angry and followed the anger of the Pentagon. The general director of the Israeli Ministry of Defense had to quit by the decision of the Americans. Yes. And he left the office. Yes, he left the office because Israel was willing to do business with the Chinese and not listening to the Pentagon. Now, this tension is an old tension. I'm talking about 2005. So there is nothing new. Israel looks at the huge Chinese economy and Israel wants to get some of the fruits of the Chinese economy. And the US doesn't like that. Now, the Chinese is now building the ports in Haifa and other places, Chinese companies, and the Americans do not like that. Now, Israel, since 2005, when there was a huge earthquake in the relationship between the Pentagon and the security establishment of Israel. Israel is walking what we call walking on eggs between the two superpowers. I'm sure for Netanyahu, the Trump administration is more important because Trump administration is a strategic, close ally of Israel, with historically moving the embassy of the U.S., recognition of the Golan Heights, and the new Trump with the annexation. He cannot lose Trump, but he doesn't want to lose China. So they will have to figure how to live with the two superpowers along and without breaking any egg. It's very difficult.
But Yaron, it comes to a breaking point with British Prime Minister President Trump had a screaming match on the telephone in February about Huawei. And just since he came out of coronavirus, Boris Johnson has just announced that the Chinese telecom relationship in Britain will cease by 2023. So even with the British, who are so close to the Americans as well, there comes a point when there's this angst and tension, and have to have Falcon or no Falcon. You have to have avionics, no avionics.
Knowing Mr. Netanyahu, he doesn't want to get to the point. He will try to make a detour under the bridge, on the sea, from the left or the right, not to the point that he has to make decision between mommy and daddy. And he doesn't want to get to that point. How he will do that, I cannot give you an answer, because I'm not sure Mr. Netanyahu knows the answer at the moment. But it's quite clear that if he gets to the point, it's the US or China, it's the US.
Now they've got a broader cabinet. There was a decision to have the equivalent of what we have in Australia, something attached to the Treasury portfolio called Foreign Investment Review Board. And you have independent recommendations from them about if this Chinese project is good and doesn't affect strategic interests, it goes ahead. If it does affect strategic interests, the Treasurer or the Prime Minister can overrule it. So I hope that cabinet decision is going to be pursued now you have a comprehensive government, because these things should be decided objectively, and then the Chinese can be assured it's not just persecution against us. Everything that affects strategic interests, we rule out. That's what we do in Australia, and it's very good for our economic health. The Foreign Minister of China doesn't speak to our Foreign Minister. They're broilers with us, but we sell them lots and lots of stuff.
But you have to put one issue in when we talk about Israel, is the close relationship between Trump and Netanyahu. It's a strategic relationship, and Netanyahu will not break it. So this is an assumption we have to remember. We'll see.
Okay.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, Yaron, I want to thank you for your great answers, and I want to thank you, Michael, for being a co-host today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yaron.
If you agree, we'll do it again, Yaron.
Okay. Maybe one time there are flights to Melbourne and Sydney, and
we can do it face to face. That would be even better.
One day there will be flights.
You know, Mashiach will also come one day.
But we now have direct flights Melbourne, Tel Aviv.
Wow, that's fantastic.
That would be good. Then I'll be there tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, on. Bye, Mike.
Bye.